In the span of a single heartbeat, everything you thought you knew about your life can shatter. The phone call that changes everything. The betrayal that blinds you. The loss that brings you to your knees. In these moments, when chaos erupts around us like a volcano, most people discover something terrifying. They have no idea how to control their emotional responses. They become passengers in their own lives, carried away by forces they never learned to master. But what if I told you that over 2,000 years ago, men who faced plagues, wars, exile, and death developed a system for maintaining perfect emotional equilibrium regardless of what life threw at them? What if the secret to unshakable inner peace wasn't some mystical practice or modern psychological technique, but a precise, practical methodology that anyone can learn? The Stoic philosophers didn't develop their teachings in ivory towers or peaceful gardens. They forged them in the crucible of real suffering, real chaos, real human catastrophe. Marcus Aurelius wrote his most profound insights while managing a plague that killed millions and fighting wars on multiple frontiers. Epictetus developed his philosophy while enduring the brutal realities of slavery. Seneca refined his understanding while navigating the murderous politics of Nero's court. These weren't men who lived easy lives and pontificated about difficulty from a safe distance. They were human beings who faced the worst that existence could offer and discovered something remarkable. Emotional mastery isn't about eliminating feelings or becoming coldly rational. It's about understanding the true nature of emotions and learning to work with them rather than being controlled by them. If you're watching this video, chances are you've experienced those moments when your emotions felt like wild horses dragging you toward destruction. Perhaps you've said things you regret in anger, made decisions you knew were wrong while consumed by fear, or found yourself paralyzed by anxiety when you most needed to act. These aren't character flaws, they're the natural result of never being taught how emotions actually work and how we can influence them. The modern world offers us endless distractions from emotional mastery. We can numb ourselves with entertainment, medicate ourselves with substances, or simply avoid challenging situations altogether. But the Stoics understood something we've forgotten. Emotions are not random events that happen to us. They're the result of our judgments, our interpretations, our beliefs about what events mean. And if emotions arise from our judgments, then by changing our judgments, we can change our emotional experience. This isn't positive thinking or wishful hoping. This is precise psychological technology, tested across centuries by people who had no choice but to master their emotions or be destroyed by them. The 5 techniques I'm about to share with you aren't theory. They're tools that have been proven effective in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. But before we dive into these techniques, we need to understand what emotional mastery actually means, because most people have it completely wrong. It's not about becoming emotionless, like some kind of robot or sociopath. The Stoics felt deeply, they grieved their losses, celebrated their victories, loved their families, and cared passionately about justice and virtue. The difference was that they chose their emotional responses consciously rather than being victims of unconscious reactions. Think about the last time you lost control emotionally. Maybe someone criticized you and you lashed out in anger. Maybe you received bad news and fell into despair. Maybe you faced uncertainty and became consumed by anxiety. In each case, what actually happened? An external event occurred, you interpreted that event in a particular way, and that interpretation generated an emotional response. But here's what most people never realize. There was a gap between the event and your interpretation, and in that gap lies infinite possibility. The Stoics called this gap the discipline of desire, the space where we choose how to relate to what happens to us. Most people live their entire lives unconscious of this space, reacting automatically to whatever occurs. But once you become aware of it, once you learn to expand it and work within it consciously, you discover something that will change your life forever. You are not at the mercy of your emotions. Your emotions are the result of choices you make, moment by moment, about how to interpret your experience. Marcus Aurelius put it this way: you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This isn't metaphysical mumbo-jumbo. It's observable psychological fact. The same event that devastates one person can inspire another, not because the event is different, but because their interpretations are different. But understanding this intellectually and applying it practically are two very different things. When you're in the middle of an emotional storm, when your heart is racing and your mind is spinning and everything feels out of control, how do you actually apply these principles? How do you find that gap between event and interpretation when it feels like there's no gap at all? This is where the 5 techniques come in. They're not abstract philosophical concepts, but practical tools you can use in real time, in the middle of chaos, when you need them most. They've been tested not just by ancient philosophers, but by modern practitioners who've used them to maintain their center in everything from combat zones to corporate boardrooms, from personal tragedies to public humiliations. The first technique might surprise you because it seems counterintuitive to everything we've been taught about managing emotions. Instead of trying to control or suppress what we're feeling, we begin by accepting it completely. But this acceptance isn't passive resignation, it's active engagement with reality as it actually is rather than as we wish it were. The first technique the Stoics developed for emotional mastery they called initial acceptance, and it revolutionizes how we relate to difficult feelings. When chaos erupts in our lives, our instinctive response is to resist what we're experiencing, to fight against our emotions as if they were enemies to be defeated. But this resistance creates a secondary layer of suffering that often causes more pain than the original emotion itself. Consider what happens when you feel anxious. The anxiety itself might be uncomfortable, but manageable. But then you become anxious about being anxious. You judge yourself for feeling this way. You tell yourself you shouldn't feel like this, that you're weak or broken for having this experience. Now you're not just dealing with anxiety. You're dealing with anxiety, plus shame about the anxiety, plus fear that the anxiety means something terrible about you. The Stoics discovered that this secondary layer of suffering is entirely optional. Epictetus taught his students to greet difficult emotions the way they might greet an unexpected visitor. Oh, anger, you've arrived. I see you. I acknowledge your presence. This isn't welcoming the emotion or inviting it to stay longer. It's simply recognizing what is already true rather than wasting energy denying reality. When you practice initial acceptance, something remarkable happens. The emotion, no longer fed by resistance, often begins to shift naturally. It's like quicksand. The more you struggle against it, the deeper you sink. But when you stop struggling and work with the forces at play, you discover you have more options than you realized. This acceptance must be genuine, not strategic. You're not accepting the emotion in order to make it go away. That's just resistance in disguise. You're accepting it because it's already here, because denying its presence doesn't make it disappear, and because fighting reality is always a losing battle. Marcus Aurelius practiced this daily, writing in his private journal, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate associates you." This wasn't passive resignation but active alignment with reality. He understood that we suffer not because difficult things happen, but because we exhaust ourselves resisting what has already occurred. The second technique builds on this foundation and addresses the root cause of most emotional suffering: our tendency to catastrophize, to assume the worst possible interpretation of events. The Stoics called this the discipline of judgment, and it involves examining our automatic interpretations with the precision of a scientist studying data. When something goes wrong in your life, your mind immediately begins constructing stories about what this means. You don't just experience the fact of what happened, you experience your interpretation of what happened. The problem is that most of our interpretations are heavily skewed toward the negative, the dramatic, the catastrophic. We assume the worst possible outcomes, attribute the most malicious possible motives, and predict the most dire possible consequences. But what if you approached these interpretations the way a detective approaches evidence? What if, instead of accepting your first emotional reaction as truth, you examined it with curiosity and skepticism? What if you asked yourself, is this interpretation accurate, or is it just one possible way of understanding this situation? Seneca mastered this technique during his years as an advisor to Nero, one of history's most unpredictable and dangerous rulers. He couldn't control Nero's moods or decisions, but he could control his own interpretations of them. Instead of assuming every summons meant death and every silence meant plotting, he learned to hold his interpretations lightly, to remain curious rather than certain about what events meant. The practice works like this. When you notice yourself becoming emotionally reactive, pause and ask yourself 3 questions. First, what story am I telling myself about this situation? Second, what evidence do I have that this story is true? Third, what other interpretations might be equally valid? This isn't about becoming naively optimistic or denying real problems. It's about recognizing that your first interpretation of events is rarely the most accurate one, and certainly not the only possible one. When you open space for alternative interpretations, you often discover that the situation isn't as catastrophic as you initially believed. The third technique addresses one of the most common sources of emotional chaos: our attachment to outcomes we cannot control. The Stoics developed a practice they called the discipline of action, which involves focusing entirely on our effort and choices while remaining detached from results. Most of our emotional suffering comes from wanting things to be different from how they are. We want people to behave differently, situations to unfold differently, outcomes to align with our preferences. But the universe operates according to its own laws, not our desires. When we base our emotional well-being on getting what we want, we set ourselves up for constant disappointment and frustration. The Stoic solution isn't to stop caring about outcomes. That would be inhuman and counterproductive. Instead, we learn to care deeply about our effort while remaining philosophically detached from results. We give everything we have to achieving our goals while simultaneously accepting that the outcome isn't entirely within our control. This might sound like a contradiction, but it's actually the secret to both peak performance and inner peace. When you're not emotionally attached to specific outcomes, you can take risks, make bold decisions, and perform at your highest level without being paralyzed by fear of failure. Paradoxically, detachment from outcomes often leads to better outcomes. Marcus Aurelius exemplified this principle throughout his reign. He worked tirelessly to be a good emperor, to serve his people, to make wise decisions. But he didn't base his sense of worth or peace of mind on whether his efforts succeeded perfectly. He understood that his job was to act with virtue and wisdom. Whether those actions produced the desired results was not entirely up to him. The fourth technique might be the most challenging because it requires us to confront something most people spend their lives avoiding: the temporary nature of everything we care about. The Stoics called this memento mori, the remembrance of death, but it's really about understanding impermanence more broadly. Every emotion you experience, no matter how intense, will pass. Every situation you face, no matter how overwhelming, will eventually change. Every problem that seems permanent will ultimately be resolved, one way or another. This isn't philosophical poetry, it's observable fact. Yet in the middle of emotional chaos, we forget this truth and act as if our current circumstances will last forever. When you remember impermanence in the middle of an emotional storm, something powerful happens. The intensity doesn't necessarily decrease immediately, but your relationship to the intensity changes. You realize that this too shall pass, that you've survived difficult emotions before, that your current state isn't your permanent state. This technique requires practice because our natural tendency is to get lost in the story of our emotions, to believe that how we feel right now is how we'll always feel. But when you cultivate the ability to step back and observe your emotional states with the perspective that comes from understanding impermanence, you develop what the Stoics called the view from above, the capacity to see your current situation within the larger context of your entire life. The fourth technique transforms how we relate to our emotions by introducing what Marcus Aurelius called the long view. When we're caught in emotional turbulence, our perspective contracts. The current crisis becomes our entire universe. The present moment expands to fill all available mental space. We lose sight of the fact that this experience, like every experience before it, is temporary. But impermanence isn't just about the passage of time, it's about the fundamental nature of reality itself. The Stoics understood that everything in the physical universe, including our emotional states, is in constant flux. The anxiety you feel today isn't the same anxiety you felt yesterday, even if they seem identical. The anger that consumed you this morning has already transformed into something different by afternoon, even if you haven't noticed the change. This recognition doesn't diminish the validity of your emotions or suggest that you should dismiss them as unreal. It simply provides a more accurate framework for understanding what you're experiencing. When you know that your current emotional state is temporary, not as a hopeful belief but as a fundamental truth, you can endure difficulty with greater equanimity and enjoy pleasure without clinging to it desperately. Seneca practiced this technique during his final years, when he lived under constant threat of execution from Nero. Rather than being paralyzed by fear or consumed by anxiety about the future, he focused on what he called the present moment's opportunity. He understood that even if his time was limited, each day still offered the chance to act with virtue, to serve others, to contribute something meaningful to the world. The practice involves regularly shifting your perspective from the immediate and urgent to the vast and enduring. When emotions threaten to overwhelm you, ask yourself, how will this situation look in a week? In a month? In a year? How would I advise someone else facing this same challenge? What would matter most to me if I knew I had only a limited time to live? These questions don't minimize your current experience. They contextualize it. They help you distinguish between what deserves your full emotional investment and what deserves only your temporary attention. They prevent you from spending precious mental and emotional energy on situations that will resolve themselves with time. The fifth and most powerful technique synthesizes everything we've discussed into what the Stoics called the discipline of virtue. This involves asking yourself, in every emotionally charged situation, a single question that can transform your entire experience. What would virtue look like right now? This isn't about moral superiority or self-righteousness. It's about aligning your actions with your deepest values even when, especially when, your emotions are pulling you in other directions. Virtue, in the Stoic sense, isn't following rules imposed from outside but expressing your highest nature regardless of circumstances. When someone betrays your trust and you feel the surge of anger, virtue might look like responding with firm boundaries rather than vengeful attacks. When you receive devastating news and feel overwhelmed by grief, virtue might look like allowing yourself to feel the pain fully while still showing up for your responsibilities. When you face uncertainty and anxiety begins to spiral, Virtue might look like taking the next right action even though you can't see the entire path ahead. The power of this technique lies in how it redirects your attention from what's happening to you toward what you can do about what's happening to you. Instead of being a passive victim of your circumstances and emotions, you become an active agent, choosing how to respond based on your principles rather than your impulses. Epictetus, who knew firsthand what it meant to have almost no external control over his circumstances, taught that this question, "What would virtue look like right now?" was the key to true freedom. He couldn't control whether he was enslaved or free, healthy or sick, praised or criticized. But he could control whether he responded to any situation with courage, wisdom, justice, and self-discipline. This technique requires you to define what virtue means to you personally. What are your core values? What kind of person do you want to be when faced with difficulty? What would you want to be remembered for? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical guidelines for decision-making in the middle of emotional chaos. But here's where many people get stuck. They wait until they feel virtuous before acting virtuously. They think they need to resolve their emotional turmoil before they can behave according to their principles. The Stoics understood this backward. You don't act virtuously because you feel calm and centered. You become calm and centered by acting virtuously, regardless of how you feel in the moment. When you choose courage while feeling afraid, wisdom while feeling confused, justice while feeling angry, and self-discipline while feeling overwhelmed, something remarkable happens. Your emotions begin to align with your actions rather than controlling them. You discover that you can feel afraid and act courageously simultaneously, feel angry and respond justly, feel confused and still make wise decisions. This is emotional mastery, not the elimination of difficult feelings, but the development of the ability to act according to your highest values regardless of your emotional state. It's the difference between being controlled by your emotions and having a conscious relationship with them. The integration of these 5 techniques creates what the Stoics called the citadel of the soul, an inner fortress that remains unshakable regardless of external circumstances. When you practice initial acceptance, you stop wasting energy fighting reality. When you examine your interpretations, you free yourself from unnecessary suffering caused by distorted thinking. When you focus on effort rather than outcomes, you maintain your power while accepting what you cannot control. When you remember impermanence, you gain perspective on temporary difficulties. When you ask what virtue would look like, you align your actions with your deepest values. These techniques work together synergistically. Each one supports and strengthens the others. As you develop skill in one area, you naturally improve in all areas. As you build your capacity for emotional mastery, you discover something that might surprise you. Emotions are not your enemies to be defeated, but allies to be understood and integrated. The goal isn't to become emotionless, but to become emotionally intelligent, to understand what your emotions are telling you, to respond to them appropriately, and to prevent them from hijacking your behavior when you most need to act according to your principles. Now that we understand these 5 techniques individually, let's explore how they work together in real-world situations where emotional chaos threatens to overwhelm even our best intentions. Because understanding these principles intellectually is only the beginning, the real test comes when life hits you with something you weren't expecting and you need to apply this wisdom in the heat of the moment. Imagine receiving news that threatens everything you've worked for. Your first instinct might be panic, anger, or despair. This is where the first technique, initial acceptance, becomes crucial. Instead of fighting the wave of emotion, you acknowledge it. I see you, fear. I feel you, anger. You're here because something important to me seems to be at risk. This acceptance doesn't mean surrender. It means working with reality instead of against it. Immediately, The second technique kicks in. Your mind will start generating stories about what this news means, and most of those stories will be catastrophic. This is the end of everything. I'll never recover from this. This proves I'm not good enough. But now you know to question these interpretations. You ask yourself, what story am I telling myself? What evidence do I have? What other explanations might be equally valid? This questioning doesn't require you to become artificially optimistic. It simply requires you to hold your initial interpretations lightly, to recognize that your first emotional reaction often contains more fear than fact. As you examine your assumptions, you often discover that the situation, while challenging, isn't as apocalyptic as your emotions initially suggested. The third technique, focusing on effort rather than outcome, then becomes your practical guide for action. You can't control whether this crisis resolves exactly as you'd prefer, but you can control how you respond to it. You can control the quality of your effort, the integrity of your choices, the courage you demonstrate in the face of uncertainty. This shift from outcome-focused thinking to effort-focused action is liberating. Instead of being paralyzed by all the things you can't control, you become energized by concentrating on what you can control. You stop wasting mental energy on hypothetical scenarios and start investing it in concrete steps you can take right now. The fourth technique, remembering impermanence, provides the perspective you need to maintain hope without attachment. This crisis, like every crisis before it, will pass. The intense emotions you're experiencing, while valid and important, are temporary. The situation that seems so overwhelming today will look different next week, next month, next year. But impermanence works both ways. It applies to good times as well as bad times. When you truly understand this, you stop taking success for granted and stop taking failure as permanent. You develop what the Stoics called equanimity, the ability to remain centered whether circumstances are favorable or challenging. Finally, the fifth technique, asking what virtue would look like, transforms the entire experience from something that happens to you into something you actively engage with. Instead of being a victim of circumstances, you become a practitioner of philosophy. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you ask, "How can I use this experience to become stronger, wiser, more compassionate?" This question doesn't minimize your suffering or suggest that everything happens for a reason. It simply recognizes that since the experience is already happening, you might as well extract every possible lesson from it. You might as well use it as an opportunity to practice the virtues you claim to value. When these 5 techniques work together, they create what modern psychology calls post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people emerge from difficult experiences stronger, wiser, and more resilient than they were before. But the Stoics understood this principle over 2 millennia ago. They knew that adversity, handled skillfully, becomes the raw material for character development. This doesn't mean seeking out difficulties or pretending to be grateful for genuine tragedies. It means recognizing that since challenges are inevitable parts of human existence, we might as well develop the skills to handle them with grace and extract wisdom from them. But let's be honest about something. Developing emotional mastery isn't easy, and it's not quick. These techniques require practice, patience, and persistence. There will be times when you forget to apply them, when you get swept away by emotions despite your best intentions, when you react in ways that disappoint you. The Stoics anticipated this. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively in his private journal about his own struggles with anger, frustration, and disappointment. Seneca admitted to falling short of his own philosophical ideals. Epictetus taught that progress, not perfection, was the goal of philosophical practice. The key is to treat each emotional challenge as a training opportunity. When you handle a difficult situation well, you reinforce your ability to do it again. When you handle it poorly, you learn what doesn't work and adjust your approach. Either way, you're building your capacity for emotional mastery. Remember that emotional mastery isn't about becoming invulnerable. It's about becoming skilled in working with vulnerability. It's not about eliminating difficult emotions, but about developing a healthy relationship with them. It's not about controlling everything that happens to you, but about choosing consciously how you respond to what happens. The ancient Stoics developed these techniques not because they were naturally emotionless people, but because they were naturally emotional people who recognized that their emotions could either serve their highest purposes or sabotage them. They chose to learn how to work with their emotional nature rather than being controlled by it. In our modern world, where emotional reactivity is often rewarded, where outrage drives engagement, where feeling strongly about something is often confused with thinking clearly about it, these ancient techniques are more relevant than ever. The ability to remain centered in chaos, to think clearly under pressure, to respond rather than react. These aren't just philosophical luxuries, but practical necessities for anyone who wants to live an effective, meaningful life. The 5 techniques we've explored today, initial acceptance, examining interpretations, focusing on effort over outcome, remembering impermanence, and acting virtuously, aren't just crisis management tools. They're life skills that improve every aspect of your existence. They enhance your relationships by helping you respond to others with wisdom rather than reactivity. They improve your decision-making by clearing away the emotional fog that clouds judgment. They increase your resilience by teaching you that you're stronger than your circumstances. Most importantly, they restore your sense of agency in a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming. When you know how to work skillfully with your emotions, you stop feeling like a victim of your own psychological processes. You discover that while you can't control what happens to you, you have tremendous influence over how you experience what happens to you. This is the promise of Stoic philosophy, not that life will become easy, but that you will become equal to whatever life brings. Not that you'll stop feeling difficult emotions, but that you'll develop the wisdom to work with them constructively. Not that you'll control everything, but that you'll master the one thing that truly matters, your own responses to whatever occurs. If you found value in these techniques, I encourage you to subscribe for more insights into practical philosophy for modern challenges. Share this video with someone who might benefit from these ancient tools for emotional mastery. And remember, philosophy isn't something you think about in your spare time. It's something you practice every time life tests your character. The Stoics are waiting for you to join their ranks, not as perfect beings who never struggle, but as human beings committed to struggling skillfully, to growing through difficulty, to becoming stronger with each challenge you face. The techniques are simple to understand but require a lifetime to master. The question isn't whether you're ready to master them perfectly. The question is whether you're ready to begin.